Today, just as an exercise for school, to consolidate my learning, I'm going to be recording this video to talk about a popular religious communicator. And there's a reason why it's quite notable to be a popular religious communicator, and that's because, well, Catholicism itself has over 1 billion adherents, and people have been talking about these ideas for 2,000 years. So when someone is listening to you, it usually means that you have either a lot of power or you're a really good communicator. And I think in this case it's a bit of both, because this person, Bishop Robert Barron, is a bishop in the Los Angeles Archdiocese, and that's where the power arises from. And also he has a YouTube channel and a website and a podcast and a bunch of different mediums where he communicates with many people, right? So I want to talk about what makes his work appealing. And to do this, I of course, this is just a school task. I didn't do too much research, but I took a snapshot of his work. I looked at 3 different mediums. There was a video, and then an article, and a podcast. And I want to talk in particular about what was common between how he communicated in the 3 mediums, and what, from my personal perspective, actually made it an effective form of communication. So to start with, I want to talk about the video, right? And I want to make reference to one video in particular, and links to all these things, of course, I guess I'll put in the description. I want to reference my work. And so this particular video is about the Gospel of Mark, and in particular it's actually about just the first line of the Gospel of Mark, right? And so the first line says something in translated in English. It was written in Greek or Aramaic, and in English it essentially just says, "The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." I think it's interesting, it's interesting that he finds this so interesting. Initially, that was my response, because, I mean, that's not even a sentence, right? There's not even anything happening. It's pretty much just a title. But as he argues, the entire meaning of the Gospel of Mark and everything that's accomplished in it are contained within these words. And he goes through and he says, okay, here, the Greek word which is used in this particular case is, I don't know, something starting with A, I guess. And it is the direct translation of the Hebrew word for beginning. That's used at the beginning of the whole Bible. It's also the word which is going to be used at the beginning of the Gospel of John, which hasn't even been written yet, maybe this is inspiring that. And so it has all this meaning that of a new beginning, right? Or just newness in general. And then he comes and because the first time this word is used is with reference to the creation story, he argues that we're seeing a new creation. That's what John Mark, the supposed author, is trying to say to us. He comes to the next word and he says, okay, so gospel, right? So gospel, I mean, we always hear it translated as good news, but he uses the translation glad tidings. And he says, okay, well, maybe this did go on to mean good news, but glad tidings at the time, what this word meant at the time, really, in Rome, was it meant an imperial victory, a victory for Rome, and that was the good news. And so this is saying that this is a new victory. It's the creation of a new victory. He's essentially giving us a second translation of these words, and he's saying, which he argues is more profound than what is written here, I guess. And so, he's already sparked this controversy, the author has, in writing this sentence, as soon as he says gospel, because he is clearly not referring to a win for Rome here, and he's saying it's a victory. So he's referring to another kingdom, right? There's controversy already. The word Jesus, he talks about how it comes from the name Joshua, how we're talking about a new Joshua, how we're referencing Joshua as a military leader retaking the Holy Land, and Christ. I mean, that's That's a Davidic reference. It's a reference to David being the anointed one, the king, right? And the Son of God. Like, the Son of God was that's a kind of description that at the time would probably have been reserved for the emperor. So what the bishop argues is really being said in this sentence, or hardly that. What is really being said is that there's this new kingdom, there's a new creation, and there's been a new victory. And who's it been a victory for? Well, it's been a victory for this new king, this new military leader, who is, in fact, the king. He's the real king, right? And it goes against all the things that the Romans would have really stood for in their own emperor. And, I mean, of course, the bishop doesn't say this, but, I mean, we shouldn't really be surprised then. I guess that's what I was thinking. I'm not even surprised that this guy, John Mark, the author, would go on to get martyred, because what he's saying is definitely going to spark a controversy. And it's an important thing, the way that the bishop doesn't say details like this. He kind of has clearly thought about them. He's clearly thought about them when he wrote this, but or said this in the case of the video, but he's refined everything he said. So it's just the important bits to spark us to think for ourselves. Because really, in the 21st century, when there's, I don't know, a lot of sometimes anti-religious attitudes, people really do want to be able to think for themselves. They're not going to listen to things which are just being dictated to them. And so by giving us just this information and like knowing really where we're going to go with it, he achieves something quite special. And I think that's one of the first luring factors. To build on the same idea, another thing he does, which I think is one of the biggest strengths in his method of communication, is that when he presents this information to us, not like in the way that many other people do, he doesn't say, oh, okay, this is meant to be interpreted as history, or this is meant to be interpreted as a metaphor. He's not specifying, okay, here's how you're meant to interpret the information I'm giving you, right? He's not saying that, he's not telling you what it is, he's just saying that this information is here. And also, even though he doesn't acknowledge the fact that, of course, maybe John Mark didn't actually think of all of this when he wrote it, even that is still implicitly there. There's still this idea. It's not like we're being forced to believe everything he's saying. It's just saying, okay, well, all of this information manifests itself when you look at it. If you have the background knowledge, you'll see this information when you look at it. And really, what he's doing is he's educating in such a way that now when we look at this, now when I'm looking at this and I'm explaining it in this video, I'm seeing all this extra stuff that I didn't see before, and I would have skipped over and read this line in half a second. Right? When I first read the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so now I'd like to look onto the article that he wrote, right? So I'll put a tick there, which is kind of premature for me to be ticking them before I actually talked about them, but that's fine. Okay, so the article that he wrote was with reference to a political scandal. I don't really know exactly what it was about. He said that someone had been was offering a Senate seat to the highest bidder. It came out, right? And he introduced it with maybe a sentence and a half about this, or a few sentences about this, and that was all it was. It was an introduction. And he was drawing a comparison for us. He was drawing a comparison like many people do, and the way we're taught to do at school, right? To find comparisons between things and argue that they are similar in some way, and that we can use our knowledge about one and apply it to the other. But he didn't do it in the traditional way, or the way that we're taught at school. In fact, he made almost no reference to the actual real-life event. So this political scandal it was mentioned barely at all throughout. It was mentioned right at the beginning, and it was mentioned right at the end. And throughout the intermediary part, he was still talking about the same ideas about corruption, and he made some references to the modern world, and how perhaps he talked about the books of Samuel, and political corruption that took place within those, and how they might apply today, but he didn't repeatedly and exhaustively apply it to this exact situation again and again, because he knows and has confidence that his reader, the person who's reading his article, is going to be able to do this for themselves. And allowing us to almost stimulate ourselves more keeps us far more engaged when we're reading this, right? The audience can do it themselves. And that's one thing that was really special about this. He provided all this information that I wouldn't have known, connections that I wouldn't have been able to draw by myself, but he didn't go ahead and like just feel it all out and say all the things. He didn't say anything that I could have said myself. It wasn't unnecessarily long, but it was still dense with and rich with lots of different information about, you know, the sins of the king, even of David, and all these different comparisons that were really enlightening. Of course, he had the same strength in the article as he did in the video. He said, okay, here's just a bunch of ideas, and they're presented in a structured way, but again, they're not telling you how to connect to them, because it's obvious. You can do that yourself, and you can draw whatever conclusions you might like, and it's really not alienating anyone. Finally, I'd like to talk about the podcast, and this was particularly interesting because the agenda of the particular podcast, they were discussing something that someone else had written, and this podcast had like in excess of, 200 episodes, right? It's been going for a long time, has a big following. They were talking about what some other relevant person had written about the nuclear family structure, and how it was a bad thing. It was an inherently bad thing, and they were talking about this. And when he initially reviewed it, and he also had someone who was not really talking very much, but just asking him questions, prompting him on when necessary. Sometimes he'd speak for 10 minutes without even the other guy saying anything at all. But it was interesting in the beginning when he first started talking about this. He responded and he said, okay, here are all the different things that I thought were very interesting about what this person had written about the nuclear family, how they drew this example or this comparison, or they made this example, right? And I thought it was very well spoken, and he basically just gave even the people who, like myself, who hadn't actually read the text he was talking about, gave them all this different information. Once again, just gave ideas and gave some ideas about how we might connect those ideas, and just presenting us with information and really stimulating critical thought, I guess. And then they talked about this for a long time. They presented lots of good stances on different related issues to family, and also talked about how the role that family plays in the Catholic Church and in Christianity in general. And then towards the end of the video, they had some other questions, and one of the questions was with regards to, I said video, I meant podcast. One of the questions was in regards to the subjective nature or objective nature, I guess that was the debate, of beauty. And he went on, I guess, a little bit of a tangent about this, answering this question of saying how, if someone didn't believe that one of Beethoven's symphonies was not beautiful, like, you wouldn't just say, oh, well, that's fine, that's your opinion. You would be like, what do you mean? That was essentially the argument that he made, and he made it like using the same engaging and vibrant language as before, but I just think that it was so much weaker. It was so much weaker than all the other arguments that he'd made earlier in the podcast, in the article, and throughout the video. And it was a weaker argument because he essentially gave us the information and he gave us all our conclusions. And I don't think that people are really very willing to believe conclusions that they can't draw themselves. And if I can't even think of what Beethoven's symphonies sound like personally, but I'm immediately skeptical when he tells us, like, okay, here's the conclusion that you would make, because if I'm not allowed to find my own examples, and not given the time to do that, and try and decide for myself, given the information that he gives, I'm just not nearly as convinced. Okay, so hopefully that I didn't really write very much, did I? But hopefully that summary made sense and was clear and articulate, and hopefully we all learned something about communication.